Well, hello and good evening. So good to be here, getting ready to talk to Stephen Jenkinson. This is a Good Morning Portugal, Barefoot Broadcast and Sharing Care Portugal partnership collaboration tonight to bring the inspirational Stephen Jenkinson onto the screen to talk with us this evening, live from his home in his afternoon and our evening here. You see Em on the screen. How are you doing, Em?
All good, thank you, Carl. And you?
And in the UK there, thank you for joining us. We've got people all over the world tonight. And José Martins is here in Portugal, who can take questions in Portuguese and do a little bit of translation for us tonight, because of course we're primarily broadcasting from Portugal and introducing Stephen to more people, hopefully, in Portugal. José, thank you so much for being here this evening.
No, thank you.
Great to see you. Okay, so let's bring on our star of our show, as it were, this evening, Mr. Stephen Jenkinson. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon, evening. It's a delight to be in your company.
Thank you. So far, so good.
Not too bad, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, by way of an introduction, and I was hoping not to do a kind of book jacket introduction and do something slightly different, and ask you how you got to be the person. How did you get to be in this position as the person who people are looking to as a teacher and as a guide around dying wise and having a good death? What was the trajectory that took you there?
Oh, man. Well, to speak with authority about what you've barely lived through yourself, it's kind of a fool's errand. I can approximate it. I kind of know the authorized version of the story. But the gist of it was, the normal slings and arrows that attended my life, as it probably has done everybody who's listening. And a number of close calls, which turns out not to be very educational for many of us. In other words, we proceed like there's an infinite number of close calls available at any given time. You can just dial one in and you should be fine. And then I didn't know there was such a thing as the death trade. I honestly was not alert to it as a kind of field of either study or labor. But I was invited in, and I'm not a sort of institutional guy. And so I knew that my time there was probably limited to work for a hospital. But for a time, I was the beneficiary of benign administrative neglect. In other words, they didn't really know what I was doing, and so I was able to do a lot. When they finally figured out that most of what I was doing was sort of contrary to the mission statements of the day, then obviously the days were numbered, and I didn't get the news till the days were done. And suddenly I was without employment of any kind as a consequence of being so successful. By their estimation, so successful 1 week, the next week, terminable. And so there I sat looking out the window, wondering what's to become of me at age 53. And my wife suggested maybe a good idea at this juncture would be to have a school. Have a school, I thought. How does that possibly happen? Do you just put a sign out, virtual or literal, at the end of your road? And I'm not sure that that's what we did, but the school ensued. And up until the COVID, it was every year without fail, sometimes 4 or 6 times a year. And between those two enterprises, somehow some notoriety gathered itself around me and became something like a fixed notion or an allegation of an identity. And I became, lo and behold, the death guy.
Yeah.
And try as I might to shake the death guy status, because I'm capable of other things, still the death guy follows me around the way She Loves You follows Paul McCartney.
Yes, and I guess in this age, everything becomes a thing, and it's a soundbite world we live in. So yes, you would have become the death guy there, and that is a bit off-putting, I think. Just to put you in the picture, Em and I host a regular monthly departure lounge, and part of our work on the Good Morning Portugal, which is like a radio breakfast show, is to open up the conversation about death and dying, and it's not the most easy of wickets to bat, to use an English phrase. And what makes your work so appealing to me? I was listening again to Die Wise, and two things. What we talk about in death here can give us our life, of course. And if I may quote you, seeing the end of your life is the birth of your ability to love being alive. And that to me is so powerful. It is the cradle, you say, of your love of life. So it's talking about death that can actually perhaps set us free. And that's hopefully what we'll talk about tonight. And in the introduction, Martin Shaw says, stand up. You are needed. It's time. And I think that's a rallying call to the people who are tuned in tonight. We've got Jay, James, Suze in Vancouver, Tabitha, Colleen, people all over the world, Louisa from Feel Good Astrology. I think wanting to stand up and have this conversation and make sense of these times that we're living in, because of course, Come of Age and Die Wise were written in 2016 and 2018. And we've had some strange things happen between then and now. So you've told us how you got to be the death guy, as it were. I'm sorry to use that phrase. What happened since you wrote the books and how you see things now as we come right up to date?
Sorry, we had a bit of a hiccup in the transmission. I lost half the question. Could you ask me again?
Yes, okay. So we've heard how you became the death guy.
Yeah.
And you Come of Age and Die Wise are 2016 and 2018 publications.
Right.
Since then, some strange things have happened in the world.
Surely.
And I don't think we saw them coming in quite the way they came, but we had a sense that something was coming. What has happened since you starting the Orphan Wisdom School? Finding yourself out of work, starting the school, and then this great curveball for humanity. What brings us right up to date?
Do you know, the answer I think is going to sound a little monstrous perhaps to some. And it's not that I'm going to wish the scenario I'm about to describe. But you remember in the early days of the COVID, the vision, if you can call it a vision, was bodies piling up in the streets. I mean, that was a real, genuine, ongoing concern. And of course, a few locales accepted. It never happened. I mean, nowhere near the scale that was anticipated. So what I'm going to suggest here is this. I get asked all the time whether I have found that the last 3 years and counting somehow has tempered our unwillingness to consider demise and endings and frailties and limits of all kinds. And that we're somehow more friendly to the idea in principle than we ever were, and that we've been educated and in a sense brought to ground by things beyond our control. I wish I could collude with that notion and say, certainly that's my experience too, but my experience is exactly the opposite. If anything, having ducked the curveball for the most part, has had the consequence of business as friggin' usual. As soon as it was available, back to normal, regularly scheduled programming and the sort. And so it behooves me, I think, and sorrows me at the same time to say, man, we really missed an opportunity to get it right without having to pay a devastating price to do so. And from that, I'm reminded again of W.H. Auden's extraordinary observation about modernity, where he said, it seems that we would rather be defeated than be persuaded.
Yes. So we had a chance, if you like, to come face to face with the sort of issues that we'll be talking about tonight. But perhaps the dominant narrative has carried on, as you say, with business as usual. The death trade perhaps hasn't improved in the way we might have hoped from reading Die Wise. So thank you for that introduction and bringing us up to date there, Stephen. I know that Em has some specific questions that have come from the community she works with here in Portugal. So thank you for visiting us virtually here in Portugal. Have you actually been to the country?
Me?
Yes.
Briefly in Lisbon for a few ecstatic days, and not since, alas.
Okay, well, we'd love to welcome you back and invite you back. Here are some questions from the people of Portugal, I think, and the community that Em works with and represents here. Over to you, Em.
In my experience, and it's, my experience compared to many's, it's very, very small. But I work along the doulas in America, as well as some of the doulas in the UK, as well as what I bring then. I translate my teachings from the USA to the UK legislation and then again to Portugal. And people in the West seem reluctant to talk about death and grief. And I feel it's really important to welcome both into our homes, so we can overcome our death phobia Now, death phobia is something that it was a term that you introduced to me through your work. And I would like to invite you to share how we could identify death phobia in our society.
Well, first of all, I'm not a scheme fella. So, I don't have all the quote answers. I have a few good questions though, which seem to have held me in good stead over the years. And so I'll answer you from the point of view of those questions.
Perfect.
So here's the first one. Is it true, in fact, that the fundamental problem is, quote, that we don't talk about it, unquote? I mean, this is the conventional, I'm not going to call it wisdom, the conventional prejudice on the matter. But I would propose to you and to the people listening the distinct possibility that that's not it at all. That in fact, a kind of death language has been available for quite a long time. You know, and I know that we wouldn't be talking about this had not the advent of things like death cafes and front page news dying and all the physicians finally talking about it for real and writing books about it and on and on and on hadn't happened. So we know that from the point of view of topicality, dying is much more front page news than it ever was. Well, the macabre part is that it's news. Now, the allegation is, of course, that everybody knows that they're going to die. That's also part of the convention. But I can reassure you that I would never have had a job in the death trade if everybody knew they were going to die. Because when the dying comes around, they would just look at me and go, is this it? And I would say, yeah, this is it. The thing that I knew about all along? Yeah, that's it. Okay, great. Anything I should know? Nah, you've known for a long time. And that's how it would go. Not a lot certainly no contention and consternation and terror and anxiety and antidepressants and so on and euthanasia and so on. So obviously something's broken in the transmission from all the allegations about what everybody knows and what seems to be so to the actual outcomes that are observable more or less every day, certainly in my country and perhaps where all of you are as well. This is my way of saying that it was never that we weren't talking about it. It's what we were saying when we did talk about it. And the way I would characterize how we talked about it goes something like this. So we managed in Anglo-North America to craft a language to talk about dying in which the realities of dying never appeared. If you have any doubts about what I just said, consider how many euphemisms proliferate around the word die or death or died. There's nothing but euphemisms. It's rare, it's exceedingly rare that people in the death trade use the word death or die or died. They have alternatives, allegedly user-friendly alternatives, customer-friendly alternatives, and those are the ones they turn to. I never saw anybody with a business card that said death anywhere on the business card. At most, they would go as far as to acknowledge the possibility of palliative care, which still sounds not too bad compared to death care. Mm-hmm. So what I'm suggesting here is that the culture at large, where I come from at least, has taken out a kind of an linguistic insurance policy against their own personal demise. Whether it's heroic, as it can often be, whether it's dismissive, which it can often be, whether it's kind of new agey, transition and all the rest. But it's no accident that the word euthanasia and the word euphemism begin with the same word, same prefix. I think euphemisms function to euthanize the understanding that these things are real. They're not matters of opinion. They don't depend on how you feel. They're coming regardless. And the amazing thing is that your death and mine it shouldn't properly be news to any grown-up. It shouldn't properly be something that somebody in a white coat and a stethoscope has to tell you about. I mean, the details perhaps, but the overarching reality should be yours to care for and to do well by during the course of your life, right? So the failure to do so results in an awful lot of people crash landing at the end of their lives, soaring, being all they can be, and then crash landing in a heap of misery and malcontention and euphemism and looking for somebody to blame or too many burgers or whatever it was.
Yes. Wow. Okay. And interestingly there, sorry, I'll come back to you in just a moment then, but you say you're not the scheme guy. And I think Martin in his introduction to DIY said, you know, this is not a 7-step book. So we do talk about it, but perhaps we don't talk about it in a way that's meaningful or useful. In the absence of a scheme or 7 steps, how do we begin to talk about it in a way that is meaningful and useful?
Okay. A very understandable question. And you know, I'm going to fail to comply again and redirect you as follows.
Yeah.
Let's not make this conjecture. Let's not make this matter of opinion. Let's make it a matter of observation. Instead of how do we, you begin the question with how have we? How are we? And if you do well by those questions, then how should we or how do we will inevitably follow, I think. So in other words, the first order of business is to be candid. And the amazing thing about the death trade when I was in it is what an early and often permanent casualty candor was in contending properly with dying people. And I should say the dying people more than colluded with this absence of candor. And this is what it sounded like in the trade. You know, I'm not misrepresenting anything to you by telling you that the way it went was people who were paid to know better would say something in the order of, we're waiting to establish a relationship of trust before we get to the hard material. And I would say, understood completely. And so you're establishing a relationship of trust minus the candor about what brings you to their door in the first place. Do I understand you correctly? And they, of course, immediately become discomforted because they think, I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand that you have to soft pedal the reason that you're there to establish a basis of trust, which can then sustain and support the reason that you're there. But by the time you've established this relationship, the trust is predicated on what? On keeping things from them. And there's many subtle ways to do it. You know, you can inform the people about their terminal diagnosis, and you can inquire whether or not they're dying 2 or 3 days later, and they'll probably tell you no. Because knowing that you're dying turns out not to be a matter of information or charts and graphs or prognoses. Knowing that you're dying is a whole person understanding, not principally a physical understanding. So what palliative care ended up being, I could characterize, and good luck with translating this, but I characterized it this way. Here's what we can't do anything about, but here's what we can do about what we can't do anything about.
Can we have that one more time? Just at least for Jose there.
Sure. Here's what we can't do anything about. But here is what we can do about what we can't do anything about.
Okay.
See, it's a lot of it is smoke and mirrors. A lot of it is picking and choosing your vocabulary so that you don't make it, quote, harder than it already is. But I submit to you, the thing that makes it quintessentially challenging and difficult is the inability for dying people at any given time to know where they are in the arc of their days, you see. And this failure of any kind of meaningful star chart, this is the cause of untenable suffering. And all that scramble for, antidepressants there towards the end.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Back to you, Em, with questions from the community.
It's all right saying about questions, but this is the way that this is flowing for me right now. And it's something that I greatly, deeply respect Stephen for, is truth. And it's the ability to shine a light on truth and shine a light in the darkness where people, they dance dance around words, they avoid words. I've seen it so many times when dealing with facing my own death on a few occasions. I've come across times where I've not wanted to, and then when I make my peace with my death, and then I try and talk to family and friends, they don't want to talk. When I've sat with people who are sitting with dying, they want to talk openly and honestly with others, and they're in their experience. And what I witness is people aren't willing to share, like listen to their truth. You know, each of us has our own truth, and people aren't willing to listen to their truth or give them that time or space. And I'm seeing here the observation that I'm making is that the more we're honest with people, the more we stop dancing around things and trying to make it look nice and trying to make promises we can't keep and providing some kind of smoke and mirrors thing to divert someone from the truth. That maybe the truth is what's needed to really bring people to be able to breathe again. When I sit with someone who is facing their death because of a diagnosis or something, and they're able to sit with me and go, do you know what, this is the first time someone's listened. This is the first time that someone has been able to hold space for me while I just speak my truth, because no one else is listening to me right now and I don't know what to do about it. There's people trying to talk to parents, and parents are too scared because parents don't want to see their children go before them. And there's so many parents that have got diagnoses who don't want to have that conversation with the child and like, how do we do it? How can we go to our children and how can we say, look, I've been given like a few months to live. And in that space, you know, sometimes I say, I don't know. I said, you know, what suits this person? What is it that resonates with you? You know, where do you feel your answer is? You know, I try and help them feel into where their answer is and try and have the conversation based on their personal experiences, because I know that no matter how many times death pops up in its life, whether it's me, whether it's someone else, it's always different. It's never the same. There's no deaths that match. There's no dying processes that match. It doesn't matter if you have the same diagnosis. It doesn't match the next person's journey. So how, when everything's so unique, you know, this is I guess the question, or maybe it's a rhetorical question. I'd love to hear how you would, how you managed to go through this, because you've got way more experience with palliative care and sitting with people, especially children and parents. Like, how do you even really broach that subject in a sensitive way, but without trying to use the smoke and mirrors, without trying to do a diversion? How? You know?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the goalposts are moving. So there's no, quote, right answer. What we're talking about is quality of approach, not the actual phrases or words that are used. A lot of it has to do with timing, for example. What it doesn't have to do with is gaining acceptance or trust or somebody finding you useful or important in their quote process and so on. It doesn't depend on that. If it did, all you're left with is appealing to what has already appealed to them. You see, but if you begin with the understanding that the culture is fundamentally death phobic, then you have a reasonable expectation that with every death you encounter, the likelihood is that death phobia is gathering around the dying, not just the dying person. Everybody associated with it in one way or another becomes a kind of lightning rod for the vaguely articulated but absolutely manifest death phobia that prevails in the culture. So you shouldn't be overly dismayed when you find it. You knew it was coming. You knew it was bound to be there. Now that you see it, at least you have an idea of which direction to look. Okay, that's the preamble. Here's the amble. 2 stories in place of concepts and theories and hypotheses. First story goes like, I may even forget the second one as I tell the first one, but the gist of it is, this happened hundreds of times. So I have a very concerned parent on my hands. They have a 4-year-old child, and that parent's father is dying in the hospital. So the question I'm asked routinely is, should they bring the 4-year-old to go see grandpa in the hospital? My standard response is to say, why wouldn't you? Not to make the case for doing so. Ask why there's a question about it at all. In other words, you don't absolve the questioner because the intent is good of the consequences of entertaining the real possibility that it shouldn't happen, which is where they're coming from. What they want to hear you say is you shouldn't, to corroborate their concern for the welfare of their 4-year-old, you see. But you can see the birth yet again of another generation of death-phobic citizens manifest in this question. And so I would say, why wouldn't you? Not confrontationally, just as a conversationally even. Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you? Well, they would say, Grandpa looks pretty rough. And I would agree that Grandpa looks pretty rough. But I would inquire as to why that automatically means that the 4-year-old shouldn't see him because he looks rough. And he says, the father says, I'd like him to remember Grandpa as he was. Bingo. There's a big one. Remember Grandpa as he was. Is it? So this, what's happening in the bed clearly is not Grandpa. But most importantly, it's not even an authorized memory of Grandpa. Now it doesn't even belong in the sensoria to come when this child turns into an older person. It's not available. It's been banished because we're not going to inflict the memory upon the child. So all of a sudden, Grandpa just ceases to be. And when he goes to the funeral home, and then there's that videotape playing, there'll never be any footage of Grandpa in the deathbed. Almost for sure that won't be there.
Yeah.
And then if that's not bad enough, this is where it goes next. Not only do I want him to remember Grandpa the way he was, but I don't want my son to be traumatized. And I would say, of course. Why would he be traumatized? In other words, where's this assumption coming from that by virtue of this kind of exposure to the real thing, not the blunt force trauma of the real thing, the subtle and often sedated form of the way it is, why would that automatically be traumatizing? And they don't have an answer for that because their assumption is dying is by definition traumatizing. And that's why all the measures are in place to mollify the dying and to sedate and sequester the dying. That's where it all comes from. That's the assumption. So rather than take it on frontally, I take it on in a skewed sort of way. I will say this, some version of the following. Your son right now is standing in the room, either in his mind or the last time he was there. And this is what's happening. He looks at Grandpa in the deathbed, and then he looks at you. And he sees Grandpa's reactivity or lack thereof, and he sees you steady as she goes. And then he looks at the fact of Grandpa not being what he once was. And then he looks at you being what you've always been. And at some point, the 4-year-old, even as a 4-year-old, has to begin to decide which reality he's willing to join himself to. Is it the reality in the deathbed that nobody corroborates? Or is it the reality of the parents who are steady as she goes and, this too shall pass, and getting on with life and closure and all the rest of that stuff? And you know what they choose much more often than not? They choose, quote, the living, because they know where their next meal is coming from. And it's not coming from a dying grandfather.
Yes.
So that's where they go ideationally. And that never goes away. And I'm submitting to you, it's the obligation to choose between these realities that becomes the traumatizing thing for a 4-year-old. Not the dying, but the inability of the living to proceed as if the dying belongs where it is, belongs to the time that it appears in, belongs to the person who's dying, belongs to the people who are attending to the dying person, and so on. So
it's such a reflection of the qualities, and I use the term loosely, the qualities of our time. That's about reputation and perception management, isn't it? Which is just what we do in our culture, that in our dominant culture here.
Well, I think in part, I mean, let's credit, as I tried to do in the story, we credit the motivation of people who are trying to underplay the enormity of what's transpiring. Yes, it happens every day, and still it's mythically enormous at the same time. It's uncharted, it's unprecedented, even though it happens all the time. And it is the most miraculous and exceeding form of normal that we could possibly imagine. And we can be observing it in real time and have it completely elude us at the same time. So it's, I, for one, am trying to be on the record to say, I'm not sure this is anybody's fault. I'm not sure that what we're talking about here ultimately is some kind of egregious malpractice in the professions and amongst families and the rest. I think people are doing the best they can sometimes, oftentimes not so much, with what's been entrusted to them or what's been impressed upon them. And the learning that they received as kids draws heavily upon them later in life, you see. The other story I was going to tell you, it occurs to me now, very simply, it went like this. Happened not that long ago. I get an email. The email says, taking care of my father, sole caregiver for my dying father who's in his 70s. I'm in my 50s. We've had a fair relationship up until now, and I've read Die Wise. And so my question to you is this. My father refuses to talk to me about or because he's dying. Just refuses to broach the subject in any way, shape, or form. So how can I give my father a die-wise death, her phrase, not mine, a die-wise death, and at the same time respect his wishes? See? My answer was, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't do both. So that's my answer to this overarching question about how do we make it better? How do we fix it? And the answer is, you can't try to satisfy death-phobic people about their dying and imagine you're doing them any favors.
Yeah. As with the most profound things in life, you can only really do it for yourself, I guess. We've got a couple of comments, and then we'll come back to you, Em, with more observations and questions from the community. I so agree with Stephen Reed Children, says Colleen, who, as she watches over her mother in a hospice, mortality is in my life right now. I plan to live a magical life in Portugal as soon as I get there. And Sue, this is interesting. As a child, she was 4. First death experience was at a funeral when I was 4. Didn't bother me, as you would think. I talked about him as the little man because I could only see his upper torso was visible, and that supports what you're saying there, Stephen, isn't it, about the reality of children? And that's something, I guess, in our death-phobic culture we don't afford necessarily. That was, I mean, with no disrespect to Suze, that was some time ago. That may not be the case in many cultures now. It might be much more sanitized than open coffins even in our culture. Thank you for your comments, everybody. And there are questions that we'll come back to. Back to you, Em.
When I'm kind of jumping ahead, so I'll be jumping ahead in my notes, and it's like I feel that when we look back in history, we see death was welcome in our homes. We grew up in homes. When I say we, I've never experienced it. So this is based on what I've heard or what people have told me. I have no experience whatsoever of growing up in a home like this. But death was welcome. People watched the whole transition. They watched the dying process and then held space for the dying and paid their respects to the elders or whoever it was that was dying, and they were there right through to the end, including through the passing, and then holding space before they were buried or whatever went on. And I feel that in that respect, the people were more able to talk about it, have a drink over, around the body, and really discuss things and honour the lives that were there, and they were all a part of it, and everything was more verbal, more sensory, a more lived experience of the whole process. Whereas I feel now everything seems to be very medical. Everything seems to be very hospitalized. You go to hospital almost to die in some circumstances. There's that separation where you're not always able to see or be part of the whole thing, and that I feel stops people from seeing it as a genuinely true, honest, genuine, raw, authentic part of life and living. And I feel like people are almost shortchanged by that. How would you feel that culture maybe impacts how we perceive death in the homes, maybe in the West?
Well, let's start with your characterization about the principal problem is that the hospitals, quote, get in the way. I would suggest to you that the real possibility exists now that if you were to simply, by some kind of strange magic, you were able to eliminate hospitals, at least for the dying, as an option, and that you turn the dying back towards their families and their, quote, communities, you would find, among other things, well, guess what? There's no sustaining community available to this dying person. There never really was. And during the course of their lives, they didn't really overly contribute to the existence or the maintenance of a sustaining culture in or community or village. And as a consequence of that, they are reaping what they sowed. That is a distinct possibility. And I probably suggest to you, we can go further and say, I don't think it simply wasn't the case that everything was rolling along beautifully when it came to dying. And then some people took it into their head to see, how can we screw this up? How can we pull the plug on things going well? Because people who are well oriented to dying as a consequence of experience with it in their younger years don't automatically turn against it when they're old enough to choose. I don't think that's the way it works. I don't think that's what happened. So these things are not really about, the changes weren't specifically about how we were with dying or how we were with dying people or where we died. The changes go in the direction of culture that has not much to do overtly with the care of dying people at all. So you have a couple of scenarios that'll be familiar to anybody who's listening in no particular order. One, you have the supremacy of the rights of the individual, not the responsibilities of the individual, the rights of the individual. Two, you have this notion that it's your life to do with as you see fit. It is your possession. And if your life is your possession, then you guessed it, your death is your possession as well. And because it's your possession, you can do it however you want. You can not do it however you want. And it's nobody's business, even though you won't be there to live out the consequences that you've put into motion by virtue of the questionable dying decisions that you made. The rest of us will have to live the consequence of those decisions. But we didn't get a voice, did we, on establishing the conditions that would emanate from the way you died? No, we were warned away from it, or worse. I mean, I could go on with the list. The feel I'm trying to give you here is when the culture dismantles its understanding of the commons, its understanding of village-mindedness, its understanding of mutual responsibility, mutual dependence, and the rest, in favor of some kind of autonomy for the individual and secondarily for the nuclear family. Be not surprised that there's no second best to turn to when the individual starts to fray and wither, and all their supposed preparations, ideological and social and political and social justice orientations and so on, proved not to be very useful in clutch time because none of them were fashioned with the realities of dying in mind or in view. None of them. They were all fashioned to be an insurance policy against those realities. And lo and behold, the realities are stronger than the insurance is almost every time.
Yeah. Well, did you want to continue? I just need to let everybody know we've got about 15 minutes to go. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us. I wholeheartedly agree with this comment from an anonymous Facebook user. This is such a valuable conversation. Thank you for being here and having it with us. I would like a final question, if I may, towards the end, but back to you.
Okay. Suicide. It's prevalent in society today.
Yes.
And we have an awful lot of people contacting me. I've been a Samaritan since 2014, holding space for people as they make that choice. And they, in my experience, they all feel hopeless and stuck and trapped, and they feel like there is no way out. Have you any thoughts that may guide them if there was someone listening right now who's dancing with death, in contemplating taking their own life in some way, either, you know, through assisted dying, which is very different to suicide, or suicide because they're not able to get an assisted death, or through other issues, you know? So it's quite a broad question, but there's so many people dancing with that right now. All the groups that I admin on, the numbers are going sky high. Yeah. That many people living in fear. So if you could.
And the last 3 years and counting have only added to the numbers. There's no doubt. Yeah. So this is very important that we don't play fast and loose with the subject. Yeah. So when you ask me, have I anything to contribute to guide them, and then the notion kind of disappeared. And I would say, guide them where, in which direction? So, you know, the first order of business might be to inquire whether or not the belief is that, as it surely seems to be now, that by virtue of somebody wanting to kill themselves, they have an understanding of life that's unavailable to people who are not operating at that extreme. And that understanding of life has to be inherently respected and, if you will, obeyed or made place for. This is a very treacherous possibility, this willingness to concede that life is indeed, on occasion, more than on occasion, quote unquote, unbearable. So then what's the job of those of us who are not similarly afflicted? Are we to simply wave farewell? Is that it? Are we here to operate in some obstructing capacity to make it increasingly difficult for them to act on the instinct to destroy themselves? What is the responsibility of the unafflicted towards the afflicted of the kind that you're describing now? Are we to make the case that life is so remarkable that, you know, right outside my window, the sun is shining on the river, and that's reason enough to live? Like the suicidal person couldn't think of that on their own and hasn't done so a million times. So one of the things I'm suggesting here by this kind of rhetorical device is the real possibility exists that there is nothing further to bring forward by way of an argument that persuades a suicidal person otherwise. That this has to be acknowledged and allowed. It's not a sign that the suicidal person has got everything figured out. It's an acknowledgement that it can happen from time to time in this world, in this life, that there is no foreseeable reason to proceed, right? So not as an antidote to that, but as a response to it, which I think it needs to be responded to. You could make an observation from a title of a book by Samuel Beckett, of all things. The book is impenetrable, so I'm not recommending the book, but the title is amazing. The name of the book is I Can't Go On, I'll Go On. So think about it for a second. Think about the notion that this is bringing forward. What Beckett is saying is there is such a thing as I can't go on. It's a real thing. It's not a momentary lapse in judgment. It's not a failure. It can go that way. I can't go on is a true thing. And if you can't acknowledge that, man, the sunlight bouncing off the river will be lost upon you. That's an almost certainty. What's the rest of the title? Does he say, I can't go on, yet I'll go on, still I'll go on, but I'll go on? No, there's no argument in the title whatsoever. The response to I can't go on is I'll go on. He doesn't say I can. So I rephrase the thing and suggest to you, maybe it works like this. There are times in life when you will go on not being able to. They're both true. They can be true side by side. They can be true on top of each other. They belong together. It's confounding. But man, human life lived at the extremes is confounding. And so I'm trying to strike a very humble note in this regard, but at the same time, delivering on the responsibilities of the unafflicted to respond in real time in a cogent fashion to people who find that life is undoable. And the PS on the matter would be this, not unlike what I said a few minutes ago, dying people, people who are not actively dying and resort to the self-destruction that you've described are deemed to have the right to do so. I don't even know what that phrase means. I understand the way it's used, but I wouldn't know how to adjudicate whether this constitutes a right or not. But here's what I'm fairly sure about. The consequences that are set into motion as a consequence of exercising this right do not accrue to the dead person, not one of them. The rest of us are obliged to live out the indictment, which is suicide. And that's, among other things, what it is. The suicidal person is saying, I'm sorry to say it, but you weren't enough, and this wasn't enough, and now wasn't enough. So how does one live out the repercussions of that?
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the answers to the question I just asked would be, you bring all of the suicides before this one to bear upon how you deal with the person who's suicidal before you. And if it amounts to saying goodbye, if it amounts to saying, listen, just so for the record, I'll miss you, and that's it, well, then that's it.
Wow.
And if we have to clean up afterwards, we have to clean up afterwards, and that becomes part of the deal. And
Yes.
then we hopefully question again this notion of right because a person is suffering desperately, and reinvestigate our understanding of what constitutes good enough. And it's not sunshine. You know what it is. It's success and esteem and standing and, relatively speaking, with your peers, and how many hits you can get on your website. And I mean, that's what contributes mightily to people sticking around, sadly. So ultimately, a complete recalibration of what it means to be alive and a citizen and belonging to a place and a time, and what's the obligations of citizenship. All of these things should be brought to bear upon this question, not necessarily upon the forehead of the suffering person in real time, but certainly upon the time.
Yes. And have that conversation as a community, if you like, an open, rather than things narrowing further and further down in this nuclear fashion, for it to be broadening and opening up. Wow. Colleen, very thankful. Thank you, Stephen, for a brilliant real view on suicide. Jacqueline, on 3 separate events, my husband tried to take his own life as he didn't want to live with his illness. Jacqueline telling us there. And it was Avut, our friend Avut in the UK. I said it was me who said it was such a valuable conversation. Stephen has really made me think, and this is such a help for my death cafes. Thank you from Avut there. Back to you, Em. I think we need to conclude quite soon, but maybe one more.
Yeah, one more question. It's a big one as well. And you may not have an answer. Is there an opportunity now to train with you or Orphan Wisdom School?
That's an easy answer. There's no Orphan Wisdom School that's open at present. The possibility exists for next calendar year, 2024. I don't really know because it's a burdensome enterprise to engage in. This year, not. This year, I'm doing a lot of other kinds of things, including a residency in Italy, in Tuscany, that it starts, I think, next week or the week after that. That I'm teaching there, and I'm in the UK coming up pretty soon, and so I'm doing teaching events and musical events called Nights of Grief and Mystery with my musical partner in that project, and these are visitations of the kind of things I'm talking about with you now, not in subject but in approach. They're there, so I'm not going in. As far as I know, I should say, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not disappearing. Because there's not a school, there are for the moment other things.
Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. And orphanwisdom.com, I think, is the place to find out about such things.
True. That's where I find out about it.
Excellent. Now, in the time that we've got left, about 5 minutes now, I think it's too much to take on some of these personal questions. But I think some of the answers Stephen has given before have been helpful. I hope they have. And they give us, and I also don't want to shut anybody down. So I think what might be useful is our ongoing work as the Departure Lounge is to invite anyone who's asked a question who may still be wrestling with that or who wants to discuss it in a fair and open space. And with the some of the light that Stephen has brought us in this conversation, we could carry that into that space as well. So I'd invite you, if you've asked a question and you felt it hasn't been answered, and we don't have the time to do that now, to carry that forward into our Departure Lounge conversation, which isn't a show like this. It's it's an offline and private conversation. I'd like to ask you, if I may, just a quick point. This isn't a question, but I had a young man die in my arms after a car crash, Tabitha. I'll never forget the feeling of life leaving his body, of the final look in his eyes. I'm glad I was there with him. Really poignant and touching. Thank you, Tabitha, for sharing that. I've watched my uncle and aunt be killed in hospital. Interesting choice of words. Via the Liverpool Convention, starved and semi-comatose on morphine. That is an unfortunate state of affairs at the moment, a contemporary situation there. In these last few minutes then, Stephen, this takes us full circle, and I'm in the mode of, being a show host, podcast host, asking questions, and you very brilliantly said, I don't really have the answers. It's not about the answers, it's about the questions and the rhetorical devices. On the matter of dying wise, having a good death, and that it is a manifesto for sanity and soul, and something very beautiful that I think you're endeavoring to gift back or rediscover for humankind. How's that going, and how can we help?
Oh, that's very funny. Well, I'm trying to work myself out of a job, and I'm not been successful.
Right. Okay.
So
we need to step up a bit more, do we?
Well, I could too. My efficacy is questionable, Look, this is like trying to steer one of those luxury liners, isn't it?
Yeah.
If our culture was a little sailing catch and we could tack a couple of degrees this way, the change would be almost instantly recognizable.
Yeah.
But this is a bloated luxury liner we're talking about. And you can go hard this way or hard that way. And man, it takes an awful long time for a change of 1 degree to show itself.
Yeah.
Okay. So what this means is you have to be willing to do the work minus the payday of being reassured that it's working.
Oh.
Yes. That's what grown-up stuff is all about. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
It's not delayed gratification. It's no gratification to speak of at all.
Wow.
Yeah. On the kind of matters that we're talking about now, you don't get to know the consequences of your life's work. You genuinely don't. Yes, you get testimonials, and sometimes they're kind, and sometimes they're encouraging, and sometimes they're devastating, and everything in between. But none of this is the same thing as, so you get to know in your bones that things are, quote, working out, that it's better than when you started. No, because we're talking about entropy here, right? Inertia. It takes a long time because the thing is in motion when you decide to clamp your teeth on it. It's already underway. So there's no beginning. The beginnings are lost in time.
Yeah.
Even the beginning of your own work is lost in time. You don't know when you started to do this, because there was a start before the beginning, wasn't there? A certain predisposition that came your way because you almost died of spinal meningitis when you were barely 4 years old, and you didn't, and it stays with you for some reason, and you don't know what to make of it, and you forget about it for, a couple of 3 decades, and suddenly the memory reconstitutes itself as a form of obligation, not a form of destitution. And then you realize what you're trying to do is translate what happened to you into something that could be useful to other people. And that's what it is. It's an act of translation, not really an act of advocacy, even though I can advocate with the best of them. But really, I understand myself to be testifying almost all the time. So rather than pointing elsewhere, my manner of talking about these things is one of the public services I have available to me. And none of that would be possible if people such as yourselves didn't ask after these things and invite me to these kind of conclaves. So you see, I'm not saying that we're doing our part. I don't know that that's true. But I know this: nobody can say we didn't do this today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here and doing this today. José has been amazing, been ready to take Portuguese questions, which we haven't had yet, but I think we have. We may translate and transcript the interview, the conversation this evening, and hopefully we can engage more with our Portuguese brothers and sisters here. So thank you, José, on behalf of myself and Em, for being here tonight. Thank you so much.
And good luck, sir, for the translation, I should say.
Yes, that's going to be quite the job, isn't it? And Stephen, thank you so much. I understand you're in the middle of lambing over there, and you may need to get back to that. And we're so grateful to you at that busy time on the farm that you were able to be with us. Em, I guess you'd like to say a few words and thanks as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, your energy, and all you sharing. Thank you.
Yes, and despite that devastating news that we won't face a metaphorical payday in our time, I think Em and I will still keep going and hope to speak to you again someday and shake your hand here in Portugal. So, Stephen Jenkinson, thank you so much for being here. Thank you very much indeed. Muito obrigado, as we say in Portugal.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye for now.
Well, thank you.